to prepare chat text for the entire talk, but I'll make a few points to get us started, and we have some amazing transcriptionists, as you can see, that will be helping as well. So first, I want to thank everyone involved with this conference for inviting me. And just as a side point, this is the most amazing, innovative virtual world conference that I know about. And it is a brilliant example of how virtual worlds can be used to respond to everything from climate change to accessibility for disability, but also for people around the world, the global south. And this organization deserves to be known as a pioneer and model for virtual world conferences. I have actually been telling my colleagues at my university about this conference and about how, for instance, there's not only this space right here for giving a talk, but there's art installations, places to hang out with your friends. It reproduces all of those things that you do at a conference in addition to hearing talks. And it's simply brilliant. And so I really want to just emphasize how amazing this event is. This is an incredible way to respond to climate change, an incredible way to make conferences accessible. So even though that's not my topic for today, I cannot say that enough. This really is an amazing event. And so let me also just explain a couple terms that I'll be using in my talk. So ethnographic research, when you do that kind of research, which I do as an anthropologist, you're trying to explain a culture, a way of life from the perspectives of its members. And when you have done that and you want to tell people about what you have done, you typically write a book or an article. Like was mentioned, I wrote the book Coming of Age in Second Life. And the word ethnography has graphy in it from the root to write, which reflects that fact that one important way to share the results of research is through writing. But actually, from the very beginnings of ethnography 100 years ago, researchers have also used other ways to present the results of research, including film. And that's what is called ethnographic film. And people have also used film as a form of data collection. A way to learn about a culture, right, is by filming people doing that kind of thing. So the talk I'm going to give today is based on an unpublished chapter of a book that I'm writing. And so I will be thankful actually for any comments, because this is not published anywhere yet. This is brand new thinking that I'm trying to think about. And so what I'm going to talk about is how I think that this film, Our Digital Selves, which I will talk about now, you can see it on YouTube if you haven't seen it yet. And at 4 o'clock today, there's going to be a discussion with Drax, the filmmaker, and some people involved in the film. I should be able to sit there in the audience, at least for part of that as well. But how Our Digital Selves is a new kind of ethnographic film, which I'm calling paraethnographic film. So the word paraethnography was invented to talk about how people who are not professional ethnographers, often including members of the communities that we study, themselves are starting to make forms of knowledge that look a lot like ethnography, so that it's not just the academics who are doing it anymore. And that presents really wonderful opportunities for collaboration and engagement, and actually a form of education, right? So that's the link, hopefully, to this conference as well. So with that introduction, I'm now going to start going through my slides as well. But what I'm going to start with, these first couple slides, are about some very basic points, basic concepts that most of you already know, but just in case some people in the audience are new to Second Life or to virtual worlds, it doesn't hurt to remind us. So there's a lot of ways to define what a virtual world like Second Life is. But I think one good basic definition is a place of human culture on the internet, a place of human culture online. And that fact of place, I think, is very important. It helps us understand what is different with something like Second Life or Facebook. It's very important that we are here together in this auditorium. And I was in a little green room underneath it beforehand. So it's not just that I have an avatar and other people here in the room have avatars, but our avatars are here in a place together, this beautiful room with these cool seats and a blue sky above us. And as you can see from the little picture on the right, as some of you may know, the very first virtual worlds didn't even have graphics. They were all text, right? Like lambda mu. And so that is what is so important. The picture on the left is actually an image drawn describing the very first virtual world video place from the 1970s. And even then, when they were imagining what virtual worlds would look like in the future, you see avatars in places. And the kind of immersion that you get in a virtual world is above all social, that we are here in a social place together. There is sensory immersion of a kind, but not everyone in this room can see or hear, right? That immersion is about more than just the senses. It's about being in a shared place with someone. And just to remind you of a couple things that virtual worlds are not. Virtual worlds are not games, although a lot of them have games in them. And as Richard Bartle, a famous designer of virtual worlds, says, you know, even the ones designed to be games are not games. That's why, for instance, in Fortnite, you have, you've had musical performances of DJs playing music in Fortnite, or people can talk about the day they had at work, because it's more than just a game. And so a soccer stadium or a football stadium is not a game. You play a game in it. You could also have a music concert in it or other things. So many virtual worlds have a lot of games that happen inside of them, but that they're more than games. And they're also more than media. The basic idea of media is something that connects places, right? It's a media, it connects places. But virtual worlds don't just connect places, they are places. So it's not just that iSky is in a different place 1,000 miles from me and we can talk. It's that we can talk in this place, at this conference, in this room, right? So there's more than just media happening. And you can actually have media inside of a virtual world, right? There's newspapers and magazines inside of Second Life, fashion magazines, things like that. Another basic point that is really important nowadays is the relationship between virtual worlds and virtual reality. They are different things. Virtual reality is about an interface, which is amazing, right? You can see things in 3 dimensions. But you can have VR without the internet at all. You could have a flight simulator on your computer and use VR and not even be connected to the internet. So you can have virtual reality without a virtual world. And you can have the opposite. Right now in Second Life, most of us probably are not wearing VR gear. It's 2D, but it's still immersive and it's still a virtual world. And we're moving into a future, especially with new things like Sansar and high fidelity, that more and more we will have virtual reality and virtual worlds coming together, but not all the time. Even in Samsar, for instance, a lot of people are using it in the 2D mode. So these things are connected, but they're also not the same. The final point, which is very relevant to this conference, has to do with the relationship between the digital, the online, and the real. Sometimes when people are talking quickly, they will say IRL, in real life. But if you think the digital and the real are separate, then there's nothing more to say, right? That's clearly wrong. And what I have proposed in an article I published a couple of years ago is this. A better way to think about it is as a grid. And because this is a virtual world, I can even walk back here up to it and like fly around and show you. So some things digital could be unreal. For instance, your role playing in a virtual world. That's the D here. But some things are digital, they're digital or real. That's B. If I study German online, I could go to Germany and talk to people. And the whole idea of education in virtual worlds is based on the reality that B is true, that the digital can be real. Otherwise, you can't have education. That would make any sense, right? But then also look at A and C. I think those are important as well. Because when people have that earlier way of talking, this way that I said was incorrect, it's incorrect in two ways. It's incorrect because sometimes the online is real. But in the other direction, just because something is physical doesn't always mean it's real. That's why we have Halloween. That's why we have Hollywood. You can do role playing in the physical world too. So it all depends on your definition of the real, of course, but not everything physical is real. And that is also a dangerous assumption. So the more interesting question for us is to think about when things are real, when they aren't, different definitions of what counts as real. But we don't want to assume that 100% of the time online is not real and 100% of the time physical is real, because that is clearly incorrect at a very basic level. Now, it may surprise you, and I'll explain at the end of the talk why I think this is actually politically important, but I won't be talking that much about disability today. But just briefly, a couple things to mention from the rich, wonderful literature about disability that is out there by scholars, many of whom themselves have a disability, by activists. First is that disability is relational. It's not just about your own body, but the world that your body is in. So if you are someone who uses a wheelchair, your ability or disability is not just shaped by that, but by the question, do you live in a world full of stairs? If you live in a place where there are stairs everywhere, that shapes your disability experience, right? A second point is that throughout human history, people with disabilities, disabled people, have often been pioneers in the use of technology, whether that's eyeglasses or crutches, wheelchairs, other kinds of technologies. Disabled folks are often in front of everyone else when it comes to the creative use of new technologies. And the final point I will make is so many interesting things happen when disability goes online. And you are embodied in new places. You can have new kinds of bodies. It can make some disabilities become invisible. It can make other ones become visible. when we were getting ready about a few minutes ago before this talk, we were checking the sound and someone asked Ice Guy, "Oh, Ice Guy, can you hear us? Is it working?" And Ice Guy said, remember, actually, I'm deaf. And we laughed about it, about how that's sort of a cool thing that can happen sometimes in a virtual world, is that Ice Guy might interact with people and they wouldn't know that she was deaf, right? But some people who have a hand tremor, let's say because of Parkinson's, and cannot type very well, that might not be very visible in the physical world, but it might be very visible in Second Life if people are trying to type, right? So that could become more visible. So as Ice Guy mentioned, this film and the talk I'm giving today comes out of a 3-year project that ended last year that I did with my friend Donna Davis at the University of Oregon, whose basketball team beat my basketball team, but I forgive her in the March Madness last week, I think it was. And it builds on prior research that both she and I had done before we collaborated on this project. And one of the questions that we were interested in, building on what I was saying earlier, is how do virtual worlds as places offer new possibilities for disability? What are disabled folks doing in them? Because the common answer we get is typically around mobility. Someone who can't leave the house, they can't drive. With Second Life, they can meet other people. And that is true in some cases. But many disabled folks in Second Life can drive, or they can walk, they can get out of the house. It's not just about a limitation of mobility for many people. That's part of it, but there's more. And we wanted to look at that. And we used many different methods: interviews, focus groups, participant observation, hanging out with people. And we tried a new method we called participant building, where we actually had islands on Second Life where disabled folks were given some land on which to build. And you'll see an example of that in a moment. And as Ice Guy mentioned, through a lucky set of circumstances, we were able to get an incredible filmmaker, Drax, to make a documentary about the research, which is what I'm talking about today, which I'm going to call a paraethnographic film. And if you can, watch it before the discussion. And in my slides today, I'm going to actually give you some things to look for. So if you can watch it between now and 4 p.m., right now it'll be in the text chat as well, thanks to Carolyn, some things you can look for when you're watching the film. So some quick background. As I said at the beginning, ethnographers have been making film actually for a long time. People don't realize that always. And the first full-length film that is an ethnographic film was actually done, as you can see, by this guy, Robert Flaherty, almost 100 years ago. And so ethnographers for a long time, and some of them are sociologists, communication scholars, not all anthropologists like me, have been using film for data collection, for presenting the results of research, or sometimes for both. And so those have been some uses. Oh, thanks for putting up the link to the film. So now I want to talk about some of the innovative things that the people in this film, Our Digital Selves, did together with Drax, the director. So there are some really interesting uses of what's called reenactment. And if you think about a documentary that you've watched, all the time they will reenact something that happened last year or 2 years ago, right? They will have actors or sometimes the actual people involved reenact an event because there was nowhere there to film it, no one to film it when it happened. And as some scholars have noted, this goes back to the earliest days of film. And there's many people who do ethnographic film who think it's very helpful. And I've put up a couple names of people. It was used in this famous early film about I believe it was around Eskimos in 1922, Nanook in the North. But some ethnographers don't like it so much. So one example, here's a quotation from a very good ethnographer who was doing work in Mexico in a village. And as I say here, that the elders and their wives suggested that they might reenact something for us, but he politely rejected that. And I would not have made that decision because the concern people have sometimes is that if you reenact something, it's not real. And remember, I was talking about what counts as real earlier, right? It's very interesting. If someone reenacts something, is it not real? And I disagree with that. I think that reenactment is real. And even if we don't talk about film, in our everyday lives, we repeat things a lot. We get up every morning, we make coffee, we repeat things, we reenact in our everyday lives, actually. So I am not afraid of reenactment. I think it can be a really interesting tool. And it is used in this film, Our Digital Selves, in some very creative ways. So one concept that I have created to talk about this is virtual enactment, using a virtual world to realize a story on film, to work together to make it real in a sense. And in Our Digital Selves, in this film, Drax, the director, and the people involved in the film actually use two different techniques to do this. One I call virtual reenactment, and the other I call virtual staging. And I would love to play you short clips of it here, but it's complicated to play video in Second Life, and we don't want everything to crash. You know the story. So instead, I'm going to describe it and give you the times involved so you can see it later between now and 4 o'clock if you can. So one example is a story that Jaden tells in the film, and it begins 5 minutes and 58 seconds into the film, as you can see. So if you get a chance, here's just 1 minute that gives you a great example of Jaden reenacting a scene of going into a doctor's office and people don't believe that she has a disability. And at the end, she talks about this idea of a brain sling. And I believe that Jaden is here today. So, hey, Jaden, it's really wonderful. I encourage you to take a look at that. Another example of this virtual enactment is by this person. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of her before, Ice Guy. And there is a wonderful example where Ice Guy is reenacting an example of a story from her childhood and actually using something she built on the island that we made for the research. And that begins 9 minutes and 2 seconds into the film. If you get a chance, just even if you don't have time to watch the whole film, just watch that minute there, and it'll give you an example of her reenacting a story from her childhood. So that's another example. A third example is from Daisy, but this is an example of the virtual staging. So part of this scene is Daisy talks about her thoughts about the media and disability. And Drax actually makes a book that has that title on it, My Thoughts on the Media and Disability. And she tells a story about how often when you see disabled people on film, there's an assumption that they have a very sad life, and they are miserable. And when she's telling this story, you see her with the director's camera looking into a room, and someone is like a lonely disabled person in the room. But it is not reenacting something that happened before. It is staging something new, if you see what I'm saying. That's why I have these two ideas of virtual reenactment and virtual staging. This is an example of virtual staging. And if you watch these clips, you'll notice that Drax and the people in the film use the same technical methods to do these two things. Building sets inside of Second Life, and actually Marianne McCann and other people did amazing work with that as well. Avatars acting out the roles. You have the protagonist, Jaden or Ice Sky or Daisy, speaking, right, in a voiceover, telling a story. And sometimes you'll see a scene that combines reenactment and staging. So for instance, that first example I gave, where Jaden talks about a time when she went to a doctor's office, and then at the end she talks about this brain sling and she puts one on. Well, that is not from that history. That part didn't happen. That is actually staging an idea that she has come up with, right? So you see both of those things happening at the same time in some of the scenes. Really interesting, and I encourage you to watch those. And so what they are doing here is really pushing us to think about the relationship between representation and reality. One famous scholar about ethnographic film talks about how it involves creating an ideal world in the likeness of the real. And it just makes me think about virtual worlds and ideal worlds, right? There are many other examples in the film. There's a story from Cody that is another great example. And that happens 34 minutes into the film, where he tells a story about his own history. And then also you see a party happening. Yes, Cody rules. Everyone in this film rules. But once again, you see him in a director's chair. He's telling a very powerful story. So this is a really interesting technique that is being used. And you see in all of these cases, the director is working with a disabled person, but other people are helping out as well. They're playing the roles of the mother or the doctor at the clinic. They're helping design the sets. So you're seeing lots and lots of collaboration. And actually, collaboration as an idea shows up a lot in disability theory and disability experience, particularly, for instance, when people talk about the role of caregivers and care, and forms of mutual help that show up, right? Now, in ethnographic film, historically, when people talk about collaboration, they usually talk about the relationship between the researcher like me and the community that's being studied. And as the quote at the bottom of that slide mentions, now, in 2019, it's not a good idea, it's not ethical to even imagine making a film without working with and including members of that community. You don't just want to hide who you are, be a fly on the wall and film people without telling them. It's unethical, and it's also bad research, right? So that collaboration has been talked about for a while, and it's very important. And what you see with this film, which you could almost call ethnographic machinima, right? Machinima means films made inside a Second Life, right? It can extend this and do really interesting things. When I interviewed Drax about this question, here's a quote from him that I would just share with you. That's about the scene with Cody, where he says, when I was working with Cody, he was very adamant about how the avatars looked, how they dressed. He was working on critiquing the set. So he was more than just a talking head, right? He was like a set supervisor or a location manager. That's really interesting, right? For thinking about these new forms of collaboration, where someone isn't just being interviewed, they're actually helping shape the film itself. So interesting and so creative. And one thing that Drax told me that was really important is that Donna and I, Trady and I, when we, started this, we said to him, the people in the film don't all have to show who they are in the physical world. So many people, Ice Guy is an example, Jaden is an example, did not show their physical world bodies. Drax has made other films before where the people paying for the film have said, we won't give you money unless everyone in the film appears physically also, because otherwise we think they're lying. We don't know what's real, right? That kind of silly idea. And Trady and I said, we have no problem with people appearing physically or not, because avatar embodiment is real. And right, that really teaches us something. So about half of the people in the film, more than half, don't appear in the physical world, but their stories are just as important. They get just as much time in the film. They are just as rich and interesting. And so one thing that we learn from this also is how when we think about disability and embodiment, right, avatar embodiment, it's not always about this idea that you can be different. And the idea that you hear sometimes is, oh, someone who is an amputee can have 2 legs in Second Life. Someone who looks a certain way, they can look however they want in Second Life. But if you watch this film, here are 2 great examples of people who explain how they are disabled. They're a disabled person, but they on purpose have an avatar that looks similar to their physical body. Lady talks about that and has a really wonderful story about that. It starts at 32:31 into the film. So if you get a chance, this is just like a 1-minute piece of it. Her whole story is amazing. I encourage you to watch it. But if you don't have much time before 4 o'clock, even to watch this example, I really encourage you to do that. Another example from the film is Varahi. At 46 minutes and a half minutes in, you'll see a place where she talks about how she created her avatar to be similar to her physical life body. Once again, so interesting that it's not always about difference. So what I'm trying to think about here is, what is this film? It's not just a regular documentary. And it's not just a regular ethnographic film. It's something really different. And that's why I call it a paraethnographic film, because it's not just about the collaboration between the filmmaker and the ethnographer and the community, between me over here and the people in the community. And it's not just about the collaboration between Drax and the community. What that red line shows is it's also about the collaboration between Drax and me and Trady. And that part hasn't been talked about much. And I think it's a really interesting thing to think about more. So the idea of paraethnography, think about a word like paramedic or paralegal. Someone who is not a doctor, but they do medical things. Someone who's not a lawyer, but they do legal things. So this idea of paraethnography, 2 of the people who came up with the term, one thing they say is, how do we do what we do when the people that we study are themselves doing things that look very similar to what we're doing, right? So Drax and the members of the community making this film are doing something very similar to what Trady and I are doing. And I think that's really important, because historically, some anthropologists or other ethnographers who make films talk about participating with the community they study And then they'll just mention briefly, oh, by the way, I worked with a filmmaker, but they don't talk about that, right? And here are two examples where an ethnographer will talk about their work with the community, but then also mention, oh, by the way, I worked with a filmmaker. And one thing I want to think about with this idea of paraethnographic film is that my relationship to Drax and Trady's relationship to Drax is also an important part of this story, right? It's an important part of what's going on. Waiting for this slide to boot up here. And actually, when I interviewed Drax about this, he said, the more I learn from you, from your approach, the more I feel very comfortable with that. What we are depicting here together is an emotional truth. And Drax and I have talked about this, right? And Trady as well, how our relationship in terms of making this film is part of this as well, part of the story of the film. And for instance, a really interesting thing that Drax decided to do, if you watch the film, is he treats Trady and I the same as everyone else. And what I mean by that is, for instance, you just saw Jaden telling her story about the brain sling. Drax interviewed Trady and I at the beginning when he made the film. When the film was almost done, I told Drax, oh, do you want to interview me a second time so I can talk about Jaden's brain sling? Or so I can talk about what Lady said? And he said, no, I'm not going to interview you a second time. You get the same chance that everyone else does. And I thought that was an amazing decision, and I supported it 100%. That he did not have Trady and I come back to talk about what people were saying in the film. And here's a quote from Drax. If I had done that, he called it a second round of post-game analysis, it would have ruined the narrative, what the people are, who they are, what they do. And they themselves have tremendous self-reflection about what they do. So there is an interesting example of what I'm calling paraethnography, where he made a decision in his relationship with me and Trady to treat us the same as everyone else, right? To treat us the same. Whoa, wait. Someone's saying my voice is not on Emerald. Hello, hello, hello? Hello? My voice? Hello? There we are. Sorry about that. That he made, so Drax made this very interesting choice to not allow Trady and I to comment on what people had already said. And that's a great example of this paraethnography in the sense of it's about our relationship, Trady and my relationship as researchers with Drax is part of the collaboration. It's part of the story. And I supported that 100% because that was a really interesting decision that he made that, you know, changed the film and made it what it was. So just to conclude now, when the film was done, we made a nice little set in a theater here in Second Life and had a premiere. It was really fun. Here's a little close-up of the marquee, the Second Life premiere of Our Digital Selves. We all sat together. Many of us came into the room. At one point, we actually made brain slings that Jaden had. We put them all on. It was really fun. And so hopefully today, this has been a chance for us to put on some brain slings of our own here in this room. For me as a researcher, I want to think about how might this kind of film do something new and innovative for ethnography, for telling stories about different ways of living, and specifically about disability in virtual worlds. How might it help us collect data, but also present the results of data? Because for me as a researcher, the making of this film was something I could study. It was really fun and interesting to talk to people about what they were doing making the film, talking to Drax. I mean, it's so hard as a director. He interviewed so many people, he couldn't put everything in the film, right? You never can. How did he make those choices? That kind of thing was really interesting. But also, more broadly, what might these kinds of techniques do for thinking about education, right? This is an education conference, about the relationship between teachers and students, for instance, about forms of collaboration in education. And as I mentioned at the beginning, on purpose, I haven't talked a whole lot about specific disabilities. And I do in my broader research, but for today, I didn't want to do that for intellectual reasons, but also for political reasons. Because disabled folks teach us about a lot more than disability. This is a chance to learn from digital disability, not just about disability, because disability experience is a source of insight about the human experience, the human journey, not just disability experience. And I feel very strongly that we don't want to put disability into a narrow frame of reference where disability experience only teaches us about disability. That the making of this film and the film itself tells amazing stories about disability, and it teaches us about disability. But it also teaches us about the human story in the broadest sense. And I think that's just a wonderful thing that this film does, that the people involved with this film have done. And hopefully my comments here have given us some ideas to think about some of the broader implications of what the film is and what it does. So thank you so much, and we have a little time to have questions. And like I said, I really encourage you to come at 4 o'clock if you can for the broader discussion. And if you don't have time to watch the whole film, it's a little over an hour long today, to even watch those clips that I mentioned will give you nice examples of some of these techniques that I was talking about. So thank you so much.